Welcome to Basic Brewing Radio for Thursday, July 28th, 2011. I'm James Spencer. Here at Basic Brewing Radio, we're all about home brewing. With this week, Chris Colby, editor of Brew Your Own magazine, and Sean Terrill, now head brewer of the Silverton Brewing Company, join me to look at the results of the BYO-BBR collaborative experiment on yeast rehydration. If you're new to home brewing and would like to get into the hobby for the first time, check out our website, basicbrewing.com, where you can find archives of our audio and video podcasts and our DVDs to walk you through basic and more advanced brewing techniques. Also, you can find our brewer's logbooks to help you log and track 50 batches of beer. You can follow me on Twitter. My username is Basic Brewing, all one word. Also, you can find me on Facebook at facebook.com/basicbrewing.james. And we also have a Basic Brewing Radio and Basic Brewing Video page on Facebook at facebook.com/basicbrewing. Thanks again to everybody clicking on the Amazon.com associate link on our basicbrewing.com site. Whenever you think of Amazon, think of us and click on our associate link first. It won't cost you any extra, and you'll be helping us to bring you this show, and we appreciate your support. We also have associate links for Brew Your Own magazine and the American Homebrewers Association on the site, too. And you can find our apps, our Basic Brewing iPhone and Android podcast apps on their respective stores. And we're on the BlackBerry podcast directory now, too. I'm going to jump right into it because we've got a lot to cover this week. A while back, we asked for your help in answering the question, does rehydrating your dry yeast make any difference in your beers? Chris Colby and Sean Terrill helped me look at the answers. Well, I want to welcome to Basic Brewing Radio Sean Terrill.
Hello.
And Chris Colby.
Hey, James.
We are here to talk about rehydrating yeast. Chris, you want to start off and kind of set up the experiment that we've asked people to do?
Yeah, when we were thinking of this experiment, we were thinking of something that would be fairly easy to do and yet yield some good results. And one thing that we'd been thinking about for a little while was doing a test of rehydrated dried yeast versus just sprinkling the dried yeast on the beer and letting it go. And so the experiment is really very, very simple. You just you make your wort that you normally would and run it off into 2 or more fermenters, and then in one of the fermenters you would rehydrate the yeast according to manufacturer's specifications and pitch rehydrated dried yeast. And in the other, you would pitch you just open the packet and pour in the yeast. And if you did more trials, there would be other things you could try. Like there's different protocols of cooling the yeast down before you pitch it and things like that. But basically, the gist of the experiment was doing dried yeast that's been rehydrated versus dried yeast that's been not rehydrated.
Now, when you're doing a yeast rehydration, you're introducing not only another step in your brew day or another step in the process, but you're also introducing another opportunity for infection or contamination of your beer. Why would you want to take this extra step?
Well, the only reason you'd want to is if it actually provided some sort of benefit.
Why would you allegedly want to take this extra step?
Okay. Allegedly, the benefit would be that the rehydration process, if you follow the rehydration process of putting the yeast in warm water, they quickly sort of take in that water, pop back into shape. When they're dehydrated, they're sort of crunched up, the yeast cells. And in water, they'll take in the water quickly, pop right back into shape. Whereas in wort, they'll take in the water less quickly. And there's also compounds in wort that may be damaging to the yeast cell that in normal healthy yeast cells, when they're in wort, will have some discrimination of what goes into the cell or out. But when they're being rehydrated, they're just sort of until they start actively managing what goes in and out, some things can get into the yeast cell. So the idea would be that rehydrating your yeast gives you healthier yeast and also perhaps a higher pitch count, because when you pitch into wort, as the story goes, versus rehydrating it, some of those yeast cells given that the slower time to take in water and liquid and rehydrate, and also the potential to take in things that might be damaging to the cell. Some of those, as the story goes, so it would be killed if you just pitched dried yeast. So the purported benefit of rehydrating your yeast would be healthier yeast and higher pitching rate.
Now, Sean, the reason that I asked you to be on this show was that the last time we got together to talk about your refractometer formula, I was looking on your website and noticed that the post that you posted previous to that, talking about that, was to do an experiment on yeast rehydration. So I said, here's a guy who has some lab experience, who has a microscope, who has done some work on this question, and I wanted you to come on the show to participate in the experiment and also to tell us what you found out in your observations in the lab. Tell us about the experiment that you did.
Okay, yeah. Essentially, over the past couple months, 3 separate times I've taken some dry yeast, it was USO5 each time, and done a viability count on it when it was rehydrated in water, and then a separate viability count for the same yeast rehydrated in wort. And what I found essentially, first sort of an interesting result is that the rehydration temperature apparently doesn't make a very large difference. Room temperature water, warm water, even cold water didn't substantially affect the viability, which is interesting because when you look at the rehydration instructions that the yeast companies provide, they give you a relatively narrow temperature range where you're supposed to rehydrate. But also I found that essentially there's roughly a 50% reduction in viable cell count when you rehydrate the yeast in wort. So for the 3 trials rehydrated in water, I got viabilities of 75%, 79%, and 73%. And when rehydrated in wort, those same trials were 43%, and 49%. So based on the results of some experiments that both I and your other listeners have done in the past, that's a pretty significant reduction in the pitching rate. And my hypothesis is that you would see the same sort of flavor impacts that you would see when using a liquid yeast in underpitching.
Now, how do you tell yeast viability in your lab?
I'm using a stain which is called methylene blue. It's not the most accurate, but it's certainly the easiest way to do a quick viability check. And essentially all you do is you prepare a liquid yeast slurry. In this case, it would be either water or wort as the liquid. And you place a sample on a microscope slide on a hemocytometer, and then you add a bit of this blue dye. And the living yeast cells are able to exclude the dye, which is toxic. They're able to keep it from crossing into the cell, and so they'll remain clear. But dead cells, since they can't differentiate what comes across the cell wall, will turn blue.
Interesting. So, based on that experiment, I mean that's a fairly significant reduction in the viability of your yeast. That's essentially, according to that experiment, if you don't rehydrate your yeast, your dry yeast, you're pitching half as much into the beer, right?
Correct.
So, not knowing that on the front end, as I assume most of us wouldn't know if we're just doing this, if we're just brewing as we normally would, we asked people out there to conduct this experiment. And one of the first responses that I got was from a gentleman in the Netherlands, Jacques Bertens. He's a Dutch home brewer. He's been brewing for 30 years, and he's founded a website called hobbybrewen.nl. That's HOBBYBROUWEN.nl, which is apparently a very popular website over in the Netherlands. And he's jumped ahead of us already and has been doing some experiments on this question of whether it's necessary to hydrate yeast or not. And so one of the things, he looked at this from several different angles, and I hope to post this study on the website as a PDF. But he looked at this from several different angles. First of all, he polled his readers on the forum on his website and analyzed 274 different beers and asked his readers to give him data on whether they pitched dry yeast or hydrated yeast and the data from their fermentations. And he discovered that the yeast that pitched into the wort dry gave a higher attenuation than that which was hydrated. And he also did. He looked at it, broke it down across 12 different yeast strains, and said, when looking at the difference between yeast types, it was shown that for 9 out of 12 yeasts, there was a significant effect of hydration of yeast, hydration leading to lower apparent degrees of fermentation. He also did some microscopic observations and testing of different yeast strains and different hydration methods and effect on degree of fermentation and effect on taste as well. It's extensive research, and like I say, I hope to post this out there on the website so that you can read this yourself. His conclusion was, for quite some years there's a debate amongst home brewers whether or not dry yeast should be hydrated before pitching. Some even state that sprinkling dry yeast on wort would lead to a decrease in cell viability by 60 to 70%. However, his conclusion at the end, after all his looking at the data, comparing it over the past couple of years, based on the described data, it is recommended not to hydrate dry yeast, since this may cause risks when not carried out in the proper way. Even when hydrating the yeast, one might wonder what benefit will be over the extra effort and risk. So in other words, what Jacques is saying is that the differences between the two methods are so insignificant that it doesn't outweigh the risk of the extra steps. And we have to give kudos and thanks to William Cloak, who translated the article from Dutch to English for Jacques. So there's one voice with some research that is kind of knocking the practice of yeast hydration, but we did it ourselves, didn't we, Sean?
Yeah.
and Chris and I have been tasting beers. If I tend to go on, it's because I've been tasting beers from Sean. But we wanted to test this out ourselves and not just rely on the data of others, the research of others. So first of all, tell me about how you went about doing a real life test of the question.
Okay. Essentially, what I did for this experiment was I decided to throw a little bit of a wrinkle in, and I did 3 different fermentations. Essentially, what I wanted to try to figure out is whether or not there's any effect to rehydration, any benefit to rehydration that goes beyond just increasing the pitching rate. So what I did was I prepared 3 samples. One had yeast rehydrated, again, US-05 per the manufacturer's instructions. The other had the same amount of dry yeast pitched dry, unrehydrated. And in the third, I used roughly twice as much unrehydrated dry yeast, so that when I did the cell counts, the pitching rate worked out to be the same as the rehydrated sample.
And then you canned those, being now the head brewer at Silverton Brewery, right?
Yes.
You have access to a canning line.
I do. It's a wonderful toy.
And so,
shipping glass bottles always makes me a little bit nervous.
Well,
so
that's
this
true.
is just a great solution for that.
This is true. So, Chris, you and I got 3 cans labeled Z, J, and Q. And before we started recording, we did some sampling of these 3 blind batches of beer here. What were your impressions?
Well, I, smelled each of them for the aroma and tasted them, and my impression was that the beers labeled J and Q were very estery and had I don't know, had some of the kind of characters in the aroma that I associate with a struggling fermentation. I thought, in particular, the J one I thought had I don't know, it was very estery, and I thought almost a note of like fusely thing in it. And I sort of, as they warmed up, especially, my impression was that J and Q were somewhat similar, and that Z was less estery, and also I thought of the three beers, I sort of liked Z the best. That was my impression.
Huh. Now, I kind of had the flip-floppy opinion, because it seemed like Z to me had, and the differences between these three were very, very, very small, in my opinion. Z to me, I picked up just a tiny bit of a kind of a bready, yeasty aroma. It seemed like J and Q were fairly similar, although Z and J had sort of a cidery aroma that I didn't pick up as much in Q. But to me, J and Q were more similar than Z was, if that makes sense. So what are we looking at here, Sean? What are we tasting? Which one is which?
All right. I guess let me share a little bit of my impressions first, because I also tasted these blind, and also felt that Q and J were very similar, with Z being the most different. And definitely sort of an off aroma that I felt was most prevalent in Z. In my notes, it says musty. But okay, Z is the double-pitched, unrehydrated sample.
Ah, interesting.
Q is the single-pitched, unrehydrated sample, and J is the rehydrated.
Huh. Interesting. Well, that gives me a little confidence in my palate that I said yeasty on Z, so I'll take that one.
Yeah, and actually I was kind of surprised even by my own observations that having the same pitching rate, I would have expected those two to be more similar. But when I thought about it a little more after finding out what they were, with the reduced viability on Z, there's an awful lot of dead yeast in that fermentation at the beginning. And so having some autolysis character in there sort of makes sense.
Yeah.
You would have essentially twice as many dead cells in there to start as either of the others.
And I guess I should say, or we should say, what beer this is. This is a pale ale, right?
Yeah, it's sort of a border straddling between an IPA and a double IPA.
Okay. Well, like I say, the differences were very, very, very slight, but they're especially in just when I decanted, or decanned the beers. The first one just did have that slightly more yeasty, bready note. So very interesting. So the difference between the J and the Q, in my opinion, is fairly insignificant. I mean, the same pitching rate, but one hydrated and one not.
We might want to take that again because it's the other one. Q is the unrehydrated, non-adjusted pitching rate.
Okay.
Q is 0.34 million per milliliter Plato. And J is the rehydrated 0.75 pitching rate. So J has more than twice as much viable yeast in it.
And then Z is
the same pitching rate as J, but unrehydrated. So the total cell count in Z was twice as much to start with.
But J and Q had the same amount of mass of dry yeast going into them, right?
Yes.
Okay, so it's just that.
But one was rehydrated, so it should have started with more than twice as much viable yeast.
Okay, right. But they had the same volume or the same mass.
Same by weight, the same number of grams.
Okay. All right. Yes. All right. So I was thinking right. All right. So if you say this is a difference, say if you're a home brewer who has a packet of yeast and either sprinkles it onto the wort, or if you're a home brewer who rehydrates that same amount of yeast, that's J and Q.
Yeah, and those were the two that all three of us agreed were the most similar.
Yeah. So the difference between that is negligible, in my opinion.
I don't know if I would personally go that far. In my tasting notes, I did note that J had a noticeably cleaner finish than Q. That being the rehydrated one, I felt was cleaner.
Okay.
But that could just be my own personal perception.
They're pretty darn similar.
Well, and I guess it is worth noting that I tasted them at least a week ahead of either of you guys, so any differences were probably more pronounced before they aged out a little bit.
Yeah, that's a good point. Now, I sent you guys 2 different batches of beer, or 2 different beers, one wet, one dry of each. And unfortunately, I think I gave Chris an infected bottle of the second batch, the higher gravity batch. I didn't follow my standard sanitizing protocol on my bottles. I just dipped them in iodophor rather than running them through the heated drying cycle of the dishwasher. So I apologize for that, Chris. But we can compare tasting notes.
We could record a Maytag commercial right now if we wanted
to. Yeah. Although I think I have a GE washer. So, Chris, what were your perceptions of the first beer, the one that you had, the uninfected beers?
To me, both those were very similar. It was a IPA, right?
Well, it was a pale ale. I don't know whether it was 1049 starting gravity. It was one of my 15-minute pale ales with light dry malt extract and 6 ounces of hops within the last 15 minutes, or the only 15 minutes of the boil. Mm-hmm. So your perception was that there wasn't a noticeable difference between the dry and the rehydrated on that one?
Yeah, if there was a difference, it was very small. On that one, I in both the aromas had a nice hoppy smell to them. The fermentation smelled really clean. And yeah, if there was any difference between them, I would characterize it as very small.
Okay. And we can disqualify you on the second one since I gave you a butterscotch beer accidentally.
Now that I try these again, though, I just took another sip. I don't know, the second one, which was... Let me look at the bottle. I can't remember. I don't know. A very slight difference.
Okay.
Similar, though.
Now, Sean, you tasted these blind, and you also had somebody else with you, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, and I actually, on number 1, which was the lower gravity beer, I actually felt there was a pretty noticeable difference. I got a more of a bright hop aroma out of what turned out to be the rehydrated one. And I also, again, felt that it had a cleaner finish, that it was just overall less of an aftertaste.
Interesting. Now, we also did a tasting at the Home Brewery, the homebrew shop in Fayetteville that Andy owns. Andy and I were joined by Mike Pagana, who is a wine sommelier who just happened to be in the shop at the time. And I said, hey, you want to taste some beers? And he said, sure. So we tasted the first one and said that it was also very similar. I had a very hard time telling them apart. And again, this was a blind tasting. Andy said that they were very similar. The dry one had a better aroma. The wet one had a better body. And then Mike said that they were extremely similar. The dry one had a more complex aroma, and the wet one had kind of a more biting bitterness. and we preferred the dry one. So so there you go. I don't know. It was kind of up in the air. I had a very difficult time telling those two beers apart, and I don't know that I would have been able to tell them apart in a triangle test. But you preferred the hydrated.
I did, yeah. And I think in the case of US-05 in particular, it's not a yeast that I particularly enjoy, and I wonder if it may be a flavor threshold thing where it throws something that I can pick up on a little bit more than most people. Because really, overall, on my beers with US-05 and both of yours, I felt like there were some fairly, despite them being overall similar, there were some distinct differences in the yeast character.
Huh. Now let's talk about two. The first one was a 1049 beer. The second one was a 1079 beer. And
that explains a lot. That was an interesting night.
Now on the second one, Andy and I called a draw. We just said we just can't tell any difference. Mike, the sommelier, preferred the hydrated one. He said that the hydrated one had kind of a more pronounced fruit flavor. Had the finish was more quick on that one. The dry one was more bitter and had kind of a longer bitter finish. So Chris, since this is one of the ones that got infected, I guess. So, Sean, what were you and your friends' impressions on the higher gravity beer?
What I noted for this was that what turned out to be the dry one had a more definite yeast aroma, and had kind of a flabby finish was what I wrote down. And the rehydrated one had more esters overall, and seemed a little drier. I don't know if it actually fermented down further or not, but also had a cleaner finish.
Interesting. So this was done with a blind tasting.
Yes.
So let's talk about the fermentation. I mean, the fermentation on my lower gravity beer, I couldn't tell just by looking. They both started out at about the same time, and they both finished at about the same time. On the higher gravity beer, the dry pitched yeast actually started bubbling the airlock about an hour before the hydrated, and the dry pitched yeast finished and fell out about a day before the hydrated one. So in just visual difference, it looked like at least on the second beer, the nod would go to the sprinkled yeast. And also I didn't find a difference in finishing gravities between either of the two. So what about you, Sean?
Visually, the fermentations on all three were very similar. The rehydrated one seems to have started a little sooner. I wasn't home to get exact times, but the rehydrated started in less than 12 hours, and the two unrehydrated started between 12 and 24 hours. However, the rehydrated one fermented the longest, at least judging by the Kreuzen. The Kreuzen on that one didn't fall until the 11th day, whereas it was days 8 and 9 for the other two. But that does sort of make sense, because actually on all three I did find a difference in final gravity. The single pitch unrehydrated beer fermented down to 1015, the double pitch unrehydrated to 1014, and the rehydrated to 1013.
Huh. Now,
so not an enormous difference, but certainly enough to measure, if not taste.
Now, what was interesting to me was that in just looking at my fermenters, and I took pictures every now and then for the magazine article. In looking at the fermenters, I wouldn't have, if there was truly a 50% reduction in viable yeast between the two, you couldn't have proved it by me. But and we've done yeast pitching rate experiments here, and when I actually pitched different masses of dry yeast into wort of the same gravity, I did see a difference in lag time, and I did see a difference in vigor of fermentation and all that. And it would seem to me that if there was a 50% reduction in viability, that it would be more apparent to me. That's just my observation.
Yeah, it certainly that would have been my expectation too, and I really didn't see that. There are some signaling factors that are involved in yeast reproduction and then the switch from reproduction to fermentation, and that's really an area that hasn't been studied all that thoroughly, and it could be that we're seeing some sort of effect from that given an overall lower cell density, the yeast are just reproducing more rapidly, and by the time active fermentation starts, they've more or less caught up. To the best of my knowledge, there hasn't been a whole lot of research done in that area.
So what do you think, Chris? I mean, are you surprised by the lack of marked difference between the two pitching methods as far as the appearance of fermentation in the fermenter?
A little bit. Although, if you remember back when we did our pitching rate experiment, where we used dried yeast and pitched at several different rates, the differences were less than we thought they were going to be too. So. And especially, I sort of think that when you look at pitching rate, the differences are going to become more pronounced at higher gravities. And your beers were both, 12 or 13 Plato, essentially 1049 specific gravity, right, for the first one?
Right. 1049 and 1079. So
yeah. So the first one, the one that of your beers that I tried, James, was fairly low gravity, or not, not like session beer low, but
right.
Yeah, and there wasn't too much of a difference there, and he also the sort of California ale strain that that we're using here is a pretty good fermenter, and so might be able to hide differences at of different pitching rates at low gravities.
Now, we didn't just leave this question up to us, to our brewing talents. We opened it up to everybody out there, and we got a good amount of submissions, of responses. And one of those was when we were out in San Diego for the National Homebrewers Conference. Steve and I were approached by Travis Hammond, who not only had done the experiment, but had the beers that he had done on tap at his booth at Club Night. So what Steve and I did was and Steve and Travis and I did was we got a couple of volunteers to help us taste the beers, and here's how it went.
Okay, so here we are with Travis Hammond, who's got an experiment we want to participate in. Travis, tell us what club you're with.
I'm with Quaff and Society of Barley Engineers.
Okay, great. And gentlemen, who are you?
I'm Kim Sparrow. I'm with Quaff.
Robert Masterson from Quaff and Society of Barley Engineers.
Okay, great. So what we're going to do here, well, actually, Travis, why don't you tell us what we're going to do?
Well, we have two beers. They're the exact same wort. It was a 7-gallon batch. It was split into two fermenters, and then I did something slightly different to the two fermenters. And I want to see, these guys are BJCP judges. I want to see what they detect and whether you have a preference over one over the other.
Okay, great. Well, let's get to work. Tell us what to do.
Okay, so the two beers are here. It's kind of a free-form experiment, but we just want to see if anybody experiences anything different between the two and whether they enjoy one more than the other.
All right, so guys, you've had a chance to taste these two beers, and I just want your informal observation. We're not doing a contest judging here, but just what do you perceive about the differences between these two beers? What's your general impression of the difference between the two beers? And we'll go from there. So, what do you think?
There definitely is a difference. Number one is more fruity, has more ester profile, smells sweeter. Number two seems to be a little drier. We'll come back and talk more about this second one in a second.
Actually, I didn't really remark on the sweetness. The malt on the first one seems to be a little cleaner to me, more like a traditional Scottish ale. I thought that there is a I don't know. I wouldn't say a difference in intensity in the fruit character, but maybe a lighter colored fruit and maybe darker fruit in the beer number 2, left-hand beer number 1, right-hand beer number 2. And it seemed, I definitely wouldn't say Belgian-like fruit, but not quite the classic cleanness of a Scottish.
In number 2.
Yeah.
Maybe a little bit of raisin, maybe something like that.
Yeah, it could be raisin.
A little dark fruit.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm biased because I know which one's which, but I would say that number 2 does have a little bit more fruitiness that I notice. And there's a little twang to it. I don't know if it's a metallic thing or just a little slight sourness in the finish that's slightly less pleasant than number 1. And number 1 smells and tastes like I would expect a Scottish to smell and taste like. This was originally designed as a Scottish 80 shilling. It was going to be about 1058, 1059, but I overshot my gravity. I think I changed my efficiency in Beersmith that day, and I got more efficiency than I thought, so it ended up about 1067. So I'm calling it a Scottish 90 shilling. That's what we do, Sure. Call it what it is.
I like both these beers quite a bit, but I thought that number 2, I really like that dark fruit character, the kind of raisin or fig character of it. So my preference, as far as one that I would want to drink a pint of, if I had to choose, would be number 2. It might not be right to the style that we were after, but I really like number 2 that much better. So that's my perception.
I think I like number 1 better.
Yeah, I think the same for me, especially knowing that it was supposed to be brewed. I mean, well, at least the mash before the fermentation started out as a Scottish. That is influencing me a little bit.
And I think I like number 1 better, too. It has that cleaner malt, that caramel note that makes you think Scottish, but it seems well enough attenuated, and it's, really nice and drinkable.
Yeah, well, they're both really nice and drinkable, so I'll defend my position. But shall we tell them what the experiment was? So go ahead and tell us what the experiment was.
Okay, so the experiment was whether or not it would matter to rehydrate dry yeast. So I took a batch and split it in half, and I also took a packet of, this was Saf Ale US-05, the California Ale strain. Jamil says use that because it doesn't have as many esters for the Scottish. And I split it, on the hop weighing scale, and I rehydrated number 1, and I just sprinkled number 2 on top. So I rehydrated this according to the directions in John Palmer's How to Brew book, and then pitched that in the carboy, mixed it up, and then I just sprinkled number 2 on top, and I gave that a good shake to oxygenate. I hit it with oxygen before. Everything else was the same though, as far as I could tell.
The gravities were the same?
Oddly enough, the finishing gravity on the sprinkled one was about 1 gravity point lower than the rehydrated one. A little bit of a surprise to me.
Yeah, one thing I forgot to mention is one of the first things I noticed, and I sort of faded a little bit, but number 2, there was a bit more of a noticeable alcohol note. And yeah, I guess from an unrehydrated, less healthy yeast, that you might expect that.
As I could check on it about every 12 hours, but when I looked at it, to me it almost looked like the sprinkled one, it had a little bit of a thicker kreuzen on top, but the sort of snow globe effect of both of them seemed very similar. They both started to finish at the same time, but unfortunately I couldn't take gravity readings as it was coming to the end of fermentation. If I had to do it again, I would do that and kind of monitor more closely when, numerically it's getting further along, but they both visually seem to be tracing along similarly. Like they were both, by the next morning they were both going, so there wasn't much of a difference there from the start.
Cool. Well, this was really interesting. I got a big kick out of this, and it was great to get some other people's perceptions. So there you go.
So there we go. In that instance, it was a Scotch ale, and with US-05, and I can tell you that there was I was able to perceive a difference between those two beers. So that was an interesting example. I mean, could this be? I mean, we're just now starting to get into these results, but Chris, could this be that this is one of those things that could be dependent on the style of beer?
Well, yeah, I would think so, especially gravity of beer. And one sort of interesting thing too is if you have just 2 batches of beer, one hydrated and one unrehydrated, there's also always the chance that something other than the hydration, causes a difference between the two batches. Like as with almost any experiment that anyone does, doing more replicates of it becomes better, but it also takes time.
Right.
So if someone had brewed 4 batches, 2 of them with rehydrated yeast, 2 with unrehydrated, and if the hydrated yeast tastes the same and the unrehydrated tastes the same, that's a little bit, or that's somewhat stronger evidence for differences here. But in that case, when you have a split wort and 2 carboys, that's not it's a decent enough experiment. It's indicative, and if you do taste a difference, it could be due to the pitching rate or the pitching method rather.
So replication of results. That's one of the principles of the scientific method is if you find a result, try to do it again, and if you get the same result over and over and over again, then you've got a true result.
Right, and sometimes in our collaborative experiments, we sort of rely on the fact that maybe nobody has done the full experiment individually, but the collective data, if every person that did it showed the same sort of pattern in their data, then you'd start to say that, okay, we have replicated it just across different experimenters.
Right. Now let's talk about some of the other submissions that we got. Vinny, who is originally from the D.C. area but is now in Jacksonville, North Carolina, because he's at Camp Lejeune. And a former roommate of mine would probably be barking right now because he was in the Marine Officer Training program. But Vinny Sempronio, he did an experiment. He did 3 different batches, and he did a time-lapse video of the fermentation. He did 3 packets of Nottingham yeast in a pale ale. He did 3 different batches. One fermenter was simply sprinkled with dry yeast. The second had rehydrated with water and left to cool to room temperature. And the third was rehydrated and proofed with wort to bring the temperature down to pitching. And he said that all 3 fermenters were pitched around 78 degrees Fahrenheit and then placed in a 63-degree Fahrenheit room and left to ferment. Activity in the sprinkled fermenter is noted to start within 2 hours of pitching. The third, proofed fermenter, starts within the next 3 hours. And then he had a loss in data because his computer. In other words, the dry pitched started activity first, and then the one proofed with wort, and then I guess the plain rehydrated comes next. He said that I noticed the number 1 and 3 fermenters cease active fermentation within a few hours of each other, and the number 2 takes a while longer to calm down. He says flavor-wise, he didn't notice a huge difference between the batches. His first impressions were that the sprinkle one is smoother and has a more pronounced citrus flavor and aroma. The rehydrated one is more bitter with not as much noticeable citrus, and the third being the most bitter without much hop flavor or aroma. He said these are all minuscule differences, and I really had to try to find a huge difference between them, but these are the only discernible things that he can notice. And he said that number 1 was definitely his favorite if he had to pick one. So he liked in this pale ale, the sprinkled with dry yeast the best. Next, we go to Kevin Pratt from Ottawa, Ontario, Canada. He did a single malt and single hop beer with a US-05. He did a 10-gallon batch and split it and did a packet of US-05 in each. He mashed overnight and boiled in the morning. He said the batches had similar head formation and retention. Color was the same and similar clarity through fermentation and after, even the same after fining with gelatin. The rehydrated yeast batch seems to have a slightly more prominent hop aroma. And I said, what conclusions? None, based on side-by-side testing. We'll need to get another taster to give feedback and send an update. He said it on such a lightly flavored beer, I expected the differences to be more apparent. And so he sent a follow-up and said that his wife tasted the beers and said that she liked the rehydrated yeast batch better, but the rehydrated batch had some blow-off issues. So there's a there's an example where we email back and forth saying maybe that maybe the blow-off had something to do with a difference in the flavors. So, but it's interesting that they were similar up until that point.
The blow-off could have a big difference on the flavor, because usually in the foam that gets carried to the top, the krausen, that's usually very, very bitter. Like a lot of hop compounds get are sticking to that krausen essentially, and some people have suggested that if you're trying to make beer that's less harshly bitter, that getting a blow off of your krausen is a good thing.
Mm-hmm.
There are commercial brewers I know that have false ceilings on their fermenters with that very idea, to trap some of that krausen and keep it away from the beer. So it is very possible that two batches side by side, that one has blow off and the other doesn't, might have flavor differences for that reason.
Now, Shane Dowling from Santa Cruz, California, did a pale ale. He also did a 15-minute pale ale, and he used Chinook hops and US-05. He said, normally I'm an all-grain brewer, but being short on time, I thought I'd try your 15-minute pale ale and also experiment with the yeast. He says, normally I sprinkle my yeast. It's easy, cheap, and effective. And he didn't notice any difference in the visual aspect of the beers. Didn't notice any difference in the aroma. And he said he didn't notice a difference except the extra step of hydration, so I think it's safe to follow the instructions. Besides, it says to sprinkle on the wort, so why bother hydrating? He said he had a little issue with maintaining the fermentation of the temperature of the beers, but since they were both in the same environment, that he didn't think that would make a difference between the two. So there's a vote for no difference from the hoppy pale ale. Matt Wide from Minneapolis did a braggot, 50% malt and 50% Wisconsin clover honey. So a big beer, the original gravity 1130, and the yeast was Lavlin D47. And he used the Palmer method as described in How to Brew, and he also sprinkled the other one. He said the Palmer method yielded a lighter color and was a bit clearer than the sprinkle braggot. It's very difficult to notice any real difference in the aroma between the two samples. And I asked about the conclusions. He said, I prefer the Palmer method for taste and clarity. The Palmer braggot color was lighter, but I don't really see that as a positive. I also like the fact that the fermentation finished quicker and attenuated the braggot more fully. So in this higher gravity beer, the hydrated apparently finished more quickly and attenuated more quickly. If I were entering this in a competition, which I will do, I would use the Palmer method when using dry yeast. The only drawbacks of the Palmer method were the extra time it took and the increased possibility for contamination. He says he doesn't think he's going to use the sprinkle method again. So there's a vote for hydration, especially on that higher gravity beer. Mike Dupong from Twin Falls, Idaho, did 2 gallons of porter, split into two. This is a small batch, split into 2 1-gallon jugs with Munton's ale yeast. He noticed that there was more activity, quicker activity with the dry yeast. He said there aren't a lot of data points for sure. His hydrometer was broken, for one thing. I asked him if he took a gravity reading. He said he couldn't because his hydrometer was broken. So he said there aren't a lot of data points for sure, but it's sure enough to show me that the dry yeast took off much faster and finished a little earlier. There were no color or taste differences between the bottled results. Not very scientific, but hopefully it's useful. So with a moderate gravity, we assume, porter, it seemed like it started, the dry, unhydrated yeast started more quickly and finished more quickly. Brian Davis from Lyle, Minnesota, did a Fat Tire clone. Started out at 1049, used a Safale US-05 yeast, and he did an 8.5-gallon all-grain batch, split into 2 5-gallon carboys, sprinkled the yeast in one, rehydrated the yeast in 100 milliliters of 98 degrees water, Fahrenheit, for 15 minutes. He says visually there is no difference in any of these. He says he brought a growler of each to my homebrew club, Minnesota Timberworts, for them to help with the tasting. Brian concludes that checking the pitching rate calculator, I see that I really overpitched 11.5 grams, both of the batches, and I think this kind of stripped some of the character out of the rehydrated batch. Everything I've read says sprinkling the dry yeast will result in a lot of yeast cells dying, and in this case, that seems to have brought the yeast count down to a good level for this beer. No autolysis flavors, however. If I had to do it again, I would try a bit larger beer. The calculator says 11.5 grams is about right for a 1065 original gravity beer. Brian says, I don't use a lot of dry yeast, but I will continue to rehydrate with the correct amount. So he says that essentially he overpitched. But his theory is that because the sprinkling brought the cell count down to the proper amount, that made for a better beer, ironically. So, and then Zod O'Connor is in the midst of like his third iteration of rehydration experiment. He did a Princess Peach IPA, which we tasted on the last show. He said that the original gravity was 1050. He said the hydrated finished at 1011, had more body and was harsher, and the sprinkled finished at 1008, was thinner and smoother. So the sprinkled actually finished in this IPA with a lower final gravity than the hydrated. And he also did it with cider as well. And then again, the hydrated sample finished at 1002, the original gravity being 1052. The hydrated sample finished at 1002. He says it has more apple, more fizz, and more body, and the sprinkled finished at 0.098, so drier and less apple. So again, he got better attenuation with the sprinkled on both this IPA and the cider experiment. And he is now in the midst of doing a 5-yeast cider experiment comparing hydrated with sprinkled. And he did do a follow-up saying that on a further tasting, he preferred the sprinkled ciders over the hydrated as far as flavor goes. So it'd be interesting to see how comparing 5 different dry yeasts in cider goes. So if we were to draw conclusions, this is another toughie. I mean, it seems like with some of these, it's clear cut, as in the question of will leaving your beer on the primary yeast for an extra 2 weeks ruin your beer. That was a fairly clear cut. You know, leaving your beer on the yeast for an additional 2 weeks won't ruin it. But in this one, it's a mixed result. I mean, some people are preferring the hydrated yeast, and some people aren't. For me, in the beers that I did, which most of the time when I use a dry yeast, it's with a hoppy pale ale, and with the beers that I brewed, at least with my taste buds, I couldn't tell enough of a difference to justify the extra step and the extra risk in contaminating the beer. So what do you think, Sean?
Yeah, if I had my druthers, I would have done this with something like a blonde ale. The only reason I didn't is that I already had one on tap, and I didn't want to brew another. the three that we were talking about, for our beer specifically, we're all fairly hoppy, and that probably does mask some things. Overall, I sort of feel like maybe it was roughly similar to what your conclusions were with the pitching rate experiment, where it may come down to personal preference. And even if it doesn't, the differences might be small enough that depending on the beer, it may not make a difference. Personally, I think I'll probably continue to rehydrate just because of what I've seen with these viability counts. That's a significant enough difference that I would have concerns, without having tried it in something where yeast character would be more essential.
Yeah, it would seem to me that if you're doing a knock you in your face hoppy pale ale, that it might not make a difference. But if you're doing a malty, more subtle beer, maybe it is worth the extra step of hydrating. What do you think, Chris?
Yeah, for me, if I was brewing, it would kind of depend on what I was brewing. If I was brewing something a low gravity, like a session beer, and or just an ordinary, sort of gravity beer in the right around 5%, I might be tempted just to sprinkle the yeast on. If I brewed a higher gravity beer, I would start to worry more about pitching rate being what I wanted it to be, more closely in line with exactly what I want it to be, and I would be more tempted to rehydrate my yeast. I mean, I do understand there's more of it's an extra step and something could go wrong, but I tend to pay very close attention to steps regarding the yeast, because obviously if you screw up something with your yeast, that's going to have big repercussions later. So I would just, be very careful to measure the temperature, use sanitized equipment, and rehydrate the yeast. So for me, it would be it wouldn't be that I would follow either protocol, all the time. I would go the extra step when I thought going the extra step was going to pay off some dividends.
Interesting. Well, I certainly appreciate you guys. I appreciate everybody else who has taken the time to do the experiment and send in your data. I found this very useful, and I have to say that I'm surprised personally at the results that I saw in my own brewing efforts. And I hope that more brewers out there will try this themselves to see what effect it has on their favorite beers. And I think that it would be worth splitting a batch, especially if you haven't been rehydrating your yeast, to try to take the extra step, like I say, on a split batch of beer to see if it does. If you like your beers the way they are, see if it does up the quality a bit.
Yeah, I would agree with that, definitely. I mean, it seems like our conclusions for all of these is always go out and try it for yourself. But it's true. And I would just add that, if you're considering moving from pitching dry to rehydrating the dry yeast, in terms of additional effort, we're talking maybe 10 minutes on brew day. And, certainly no more contamination risk than brewing a full batch of beer. There are far more points where you could introduce a problem in that process. So, as long as you're competent with your sanitation, which I hope that all brewers are, I don't think that there are any risks, really, that are significant.
The risk of contamination from adding this extra step is real, but I think it's minimal and manageable. If you're used to practicing good sanitation at home, I would think that people would be, just because they would be vigilant at this step, that the risk would be minimal. I mean, if you were really slovenly, like if you pulled a dirty, glass off the shelf to put your yeast into, and didn't measure your temperature very accurately, yeah, I'd be a lot more worried. But who's going to do that? Honestly, brewers are, if they're going to go the extra step to rehydrate their yeast, they're going to pay attention and do it right. And I think that if you pay attention and do it right, you will. I would say the risk would be fairly minimal.
Well, there you go. Once again, I appreciate it, guys. We look forward to the next experiment.
I'm looking forward to eating something. I'm getting lightheaded.
Well, Well, thanks again to Chris, Sean, and everybody who participated in the experiment. I am surprised by the results once again, and I think it's changed the way I think about yeast rehydration. And Jacques has given me permission to post his experiment results as a PDF, so look for that link in the description of this episode on basicbrewingradio.com and in the extras section of your Basic Brewing Podcast app. And I'll post a link to Vinny's time-lapse video on our site, too. Very fun. If you have brewing questions, show suggestions, or just want to say howdy, write to james@basicbrewing.com or just fill out the contact form on basicbrewing.com. And please don't forget to tell us where you're from. Be sure to check out our DVDs, Extract Brewing and Partial Mashing, Stepping into All-Grain, Low-Tech Lagering and Decoction Mashing, and Introduction to Wine Kits. And our 2011 Brewers Logbooks. We've still got a handful of them. They're going quick, though. Find them on our site. We've got combo deals to save you a few bucks if you want to buy more than one DVD at a time, and you can check out our Basic Brewing shirts in the store, too. You can see a listing of the fine folks across the country who sell our DVDs on basicbrewing.com, and if there isn't a vendor in your area, you can order them online in our online shop at basicbrewingshop.com. Thanks to everybody who's continued to click on our Amazon.com link. We appreciate the support there. Our featured products this week that were purchased through the link are Clinical Companion to Medical Surgical Nursing, Assessment and Management of Clinical Problems. Got a lot of nursing books this week. Appreciate that. And Everlast 100-year anniversary 80-pound heavy bag kit. Very nice. Thanks again, everybody. Remember, I can't tell who bought what, so no worries there. Just click on the Amazon.com logo on our site the next time you feel like Amazon shopping. We appreciate your support. And don't forget that you can also join the American Homebrewers Association or subscribe to Brew Your Own magazine through the associate links on basicbrewing.com. That's all until next time, everybody. Till then, thanks for listening. I'm James Spencer. Production help for Basic Brewing Radio and our website is provided by Kelly Dutz. Basic Brewing Radio is a production of Active Voicing. We'll talk to you next time, everybody. So long.